Perfect.
Oh, it means it'll start at 1.
Yeah. There we go.
Okay.
Yep. Well, don't do that yet. You need to move that first, probably.
Okay, I need a drink of water, I think.
You don't have to whisper. It's off.
Okay, I need a drink of water.
Okay. I'll get my computer and
Okay. Because I think it takes we just need to drink water. And then I need you to help me move this wood thing. While I'm doing that, we'll do hacking or something. Okay, I gotta get started here. Okay, so how do I do this? What do I do first?
So, you want to start?
Yeah.
Okay. Nobody's actually here yet.
Okay. Well.
Anyway, it's fine. So, you click the thing. Well, actually, first you delete 1 p.m. So you just backspace. Yeah. And yes. Okay. What? What did you just... Wait. Oh, God.
What?
Don't panic.
Where did I go?
Don't panic. Don't panic. Press the plus button. In the hierarchy of things you could have deleted accidentally, that's not bad. Video capture device. Okay. Hit OK. Integrated webcam, that's fine. Hit OK. Okay. I panicked for a second. Okay, and then, yep, click that. Now press delete. Or, yeah. Perfect. Okay. So now...
Something's not right.
No, now you need to make it bigger.
Right.
You...
Shoot. Okay, this is bigger now.
Yep. Now move
Okay,
it over,
no,
and
I
you
need
need to move that to the forefront. So edit, order, move to top. You might want to move it over a bit. Yep. Okay, and then move your face up and over a bit so that your face is like in that corner. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. Now you're ready. Click the unmute button and...
No, first though, here. No. YouTube.
Oh, it says 30 people are watching. Perfect.
Yay. No.
Move the slide over.
I want to do that, I think. Because I want to start in the right place. Okay, now what is it that I need to look at while I'm doing this?
What is it you... Okay, so, so what you'll need to do is, there.
What will I need to do, sweetie?
So, okay, so click the 3 dots.
Yes.
And then pop out chat.
No, I worked it fine last time. It's okay.
No,
It's
okay.
it's okay. It's okay. OBS. Okay, OBS I had here.
Okay, this is what you'll want to do. Make the PDF. Can you make the PDF smaller? Yeah. So take that and make it smaller. Make it a windowed.
Okay. I'm good. I think.
You're good. Okay.
Yes, I
sure.
think so. Okay. So, wait. Okay. Is it live? No. Okay. I'm gonna turn the sound on now.
Okay, have fun.
Okay.
What?
I can't.
What did you do?
I don't know, but I'm not set up like I was yesterday. So I want to be able to see my slides, and I want to be able to see this.
Okay, so here, put this in the corner.
Put this in the corner.
Yeah, and then, because you don't really need that. And then
Okay.
just move this into that corner.
This.
Yeah, that.
I can't seem to move it. Okay. But then I'm missing YouTube, which is here.
Right, so what you want to do... What did you do?
I don't know, but I need it back. Please.
Go to the create video and then go live. Okay. And then click on that. Great. You're back. Okay. So, okay. If you want to just move the chat independently, you can do the pop out. But if this
Okay,
is...
yeah, how do I do that?
Okay, so the 3 dots.
Yeah.
Pop out chat.
Yeah.
Okay, now you can move it independently. So, could you click on OBS and click on your PowerPoint? I mean your slides.
Yeah.
Good. Now you can click on the chat, which is this.
Yeah.
Okay. And now make it a lot smaller.
Yeah.
And then no. Yeah.
Okay.
A lot smaller. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. And then put it maybe under OBS. Like, move it up a bit, because you really don't need that. Okay, yeah. Just, yeah. Okay, is that good?
Okay. I think so.
Yeah.
I can't see. Did I put is the sound on? No. Now I need to put the sound on, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, everybody. Hello. Okay, here we are. Sorry I was having a little bit of trouble setting everything up properly again today, but here we are. Can somebody very kindly just type into the chat feature to tell me if you can hear me and if this is live streaming? Wonderful. Okay, so I think we have about a 30-second time lag again. So I'm just going to adjust to that. But it's lovely to see everybody on here. Thank you so much for coming. Like I said last time I saw you, if we all get together often enough, just like in class we would normally, it's really good for us to do that. And hopefully it keeps your learning going. I can see over 40 people already here, and the numbers keep going up. So that's exciting. Yes, okay, we're good. All right, so you should have, hopefully in front of you, the PowerPoint. I posted the slides online. There was a really good suggestion from somebody to do that, so that's what I've done, so that hopefully you can see those as we go along. And then I'm going to add some details and some things as we talk. And if you have questions, then you'll be able to type just as you did before. So that's exciting. All right. So economic geography. What I'm going to suggest is that this is the last major section that we need to do in the course, so that if you're going on to other courses in geography, this will be the last major content section that you're going to need. But I think it's really important that we talk about it, because there's some really important concepts in here that you need to learn. So, economic geography. Let me move the slide here. There we are. And here are some of the key questions that I think that we should be thinking about, okay, while we are talking about economic geography. So I'm hoping that that slide will come up in a moment. It should do. That should be the slide that we're on. There's a bigger lag today. Yep, okay, so it is. So I just have to trust it. Okay, good. All right. So, key questions that we want to think about when we talk about economic geography. We always define things as we go along, and then part of economic geography, an important part of economic geography, is to think about what we mean by the idea of development, because a lot of us talk about economic development and so on, but that's a very difficult term in terms of what we mean. So I'm going to define that, and one of the most important ways of measuring whether economic development is occurring and whether people's quality of life is improving has been the United Nations that has developed a set of millennial goals. So we'll talk about that. Okay, so turning to the next slide here, this has got a fun pictogram on it, and you know, we always like to look at those pictograms in class. Well, here's another fun one for you. And you should be able to see it on your slide. What this does, this pictogram, is it shows you the area of the country proportional to the amount of income that the country makes. So it's kind of fun because you can see kind of the chubbiness, as I would call it, of North America, and you can see the chubbiness of the UK there, tucked in, and the chubbiness of Western Europe. So you can see where the kind of the money is, and it's also where the chubbiness is on the chart. So hopefully you find that a little bit fun. I wanted it to be fun for you. So see what you think. Usually in class we can laugh about it and have fun about it. So maybe some of you think it's fun. Okay, so economic geography. We need to look at the definition of economic geography. And economic geographers study the locational aspects, basically, of economic activities. So where is it that certain economic activities occur in space? Where do they locate in space? Which countries, which parts of countries? And why are they located there? And why does it matter? All right, so economic development is a process by which a country improves its economic, social, and political well-being. And there's a sense in economic development of progress towards something. We're trying to progress towards improvement. I think the thing that people aren't sure about perhaps is what that improvement looks like. But that's the sense of economic development, is that we're developing or progressing towards something better for people's lives. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by progress and what we mean by improvement. So the first thing that I'd like to do, and if you look on your outline, you'll see it's on there, is to talk about models of economic development. And the first model of economic development that I'd like to talk about is Rostow's 5-stage model. And this is a very famous model. It was developed in the 1960s. And you'll see in a minute that it's very much part of being in the 60s. So his model assumed that all countries progressed along the same trajectory, and they progressed along a path towards improvement of their economy, but also their society and their political structures. So I'm going to take you through the 5 stages of his model and talk a little bit about it. In stage 1, he considers that you have a traditional society where your dominant activity is basically farming. And it's not commercial farming, the kind of farming that we would see in Canada. It's more the kind of farming where you're farming just to feed your family. So subsistence farming would be stage 1. And then in stage 2, he talks about the country coming together to create the preconditions for takeoff. The idea is that your economy is going to literally take off at that time. And I've put a little graphic in here that you can see where he details the dates at which different countries are thought to have taken off economically, or approximately. And the first country that he refers to is Great Britain or the UK. And that was because the UK hit its industrial revolution first. So you can see that he talks about a takeoff period for the UK about 1783 to 1802. So roughly at the beginning of the 19th century was when Britain started to take off with its economic development. And then came Russia and the US and so on. And you can see that those countries were already industrialized long before the war occurred, the First World War. But you can see that Canada became industrialized. And if I was in class with you, I would ask you, why do you think Canada took off at this time? But the answer to that is that Canada took off at this time because it was preparing for the First World War. So as Canada realized that the First World War was going to occur, as Canada started to gear up to be involved in that, industrial production started to take off for that to occur. Now, so you can see that impact. China and India, 2 countries that we've been watching very, very carefully in terms of their growth and population and so on, interestingly, he says took off at around the same time, early 1950s. And there was a lot occurring in China at this time. And of course, we have the Cultural Revolution coming up at this period. So all of that happening together in China. So creating the preconditions for takeoff where the leadership within a country moves towards having greater diversity in a kind of burgeoning small economy, and industrialization is beginning to occur. Then we get to stage 3. And in stage 3, what we have is the country actually takes off, and it begins its industrial revolution at that time. So whenever a country takes off economically, that is considered to be when it starts with its industrial revolution. And so sustained growth of other types of activity in the economy take off. So once that's happened, and you can see that Britain and Russia and the US and so on, this was occurring for them through their industrial revolutions. Canada much later, again, because we were more agricultural and primary industry to start with, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Once countries have taken off economically, then they have this drive to maturity. Technologies start to spread. People start to specialize in different kinds of industry. And then we get international trade in goods and trade expanding. Finally, in the 5th stage, what he says is that we get to an era of high mass consumption, where incomes are higher because of the wealth that's been generated, and there's a production of many goods and services. And once countries have reached that, then they are considered to be in a state of having a mature economy. So that is Rostow's 5-stage model. And if I can show you this, I find when I'm learning about this that this diagram is really helpful in thinking about it. I don't know if the language in this model reminds you of anything, but his model to me reminds me of an aeroplane taking off. So if you think about the fact that the model was developed in the 60s, and the 60s, it was after World War II, people were excited by new developments. It was a great era of possibility for everybody. So Rostow's model, to me, the language that he uses, this idea of taking off and reaching maturity, I think is very reflective of what was going on in the 60s. So I'm not sure if you can see that, but I hope you can. Excuse me. I may have to go and get a drink of water in a moment. I'm sorry. Okay. So think about these steps and these stages along this trajectory of kind of a takeoff within the economy. And that's Rostow's model. And those are his 5 stages. So what I want to ask you now is to think about, do you see any problems with Rostow's model? Do you think when you look at this model, because you're very good now, you guys, at critiquing things and thinking about problems with geography models and so on, can you type in here, what do you think the problem is with Rostow's model? Can you type some ideas? I'm just going to wait a minute while you think about that. Okay, so I'm starting to see some really nice answers coming through. Yes, well done. So development isn't always linear, as you quite rightly say. If you think about what's happening, like what's happened, we talked a little bit about the terrible, terrible impact that AIDS had on Africa and in terms of the population. Well, similarly, disasters and so on can have problems causing countries not to continue to develop. You can have all kinds of challenges and so on. So your answers here are really, really good. You can look in the chat and see the kinds of things people are saying. And I'm just taking a look now. Yes, it's really hard to calculate. You're quite right. Where people are in the model and so on. People don't always start out as subsistence farmers. So again, you're quite right. That's a problem. And you're starting to write some really good thoughts about the fact that this is kind of an ideal trajectory towards capitalism, and that economic wealth is the most important indicator. And you're quite right that that's not necessarily the case. So I start to ask myself questions like, how would I determine what's a good quality of life? And is that always determined just by wealth? So you're asking some really good questions here, and these are indeed a lot of the problems that the model has been criticized for. There's some accuracy to it, for sure, and there are many countries who seem to have followed some of these trends, but is it necessarily the ideal that we want to go for? And are all countries going to go through this? Somebody is also making a really, really good point here, that you can't all be at the final stage. So what happens if, say, Canada is in the stage of maturity and high mass consumption? Then my question there is, who's producing, and maybe you can type here, who's producing the things that we are consuming? I'm just going to wait a minute so that you can see my question. Yes, so Isis has a great comment there on the chat room there. If that's exactly my point. So you're quite right. So if Canada, say, is in stage 5 of high mass consumption, the problem is that not every country can be there, because somebody has to be producing the things that we are mass consuming. So and somebody's saying, when the rich people move to Mars, and yes, you're quite right, then maybe we will be the producers for the high mass consumers who are sitting comfortably on Mars, drinking their martinis or something. Yes, that's a very good joke. Well done. Thanks for cheering me up. So so you've got the point beautifully. There are other things here. I've put this on the slide. We're assuming progress. We're assuming that the capitalist model is sort of the ideal. It also can force us to sort of make judgments in language, which I think are very uncomfortable, about, first world, third world kinds of judgments start to be made around different countries, and that I think is very uncomfortable and problematic. We use terms like developed or developing, underdeveloped, and it's hard to know exactly what language we should use around this. Yuta, one of the professors in geography, prefers the terms global north and global south to try to convey differences in wealth. And that's certainly, I think, a very useful way of thinking about it. But none of the labels that we've come up with in society, I think, are perfect for capturing this concept that there are some countries in the world who are very well off and consume a lot of resources and have a lot of wealth. And there are other countries that don't. And it's hard to know what labels to use for those different concepts, but they are very, very important. And that is really what we're talking about in this context. So those are some of the challenges with Rostow's model. And as a result of Rostow's model, we have an opposing model, which won't surprise you, from Rostow. And from Rostow and the name of the other model that I want to share with you is Wallerstein's model. Now, Wallerstein's model is also called world systems theory. And it's a model that's been very, very influential. It was developed in the 1970s. And as you quite rightly said in your comments, unlike a situation where you assume that each country is independent, which is what Rostow was suggesting, that each country goes through this economic development on its own, within its own context, what Wallerstein was saying was that every country in the world is connected to every other, and that the developing world, as he referred to it, or the global south, is linked inextricably to the economic activities in the developed world. So what Wallerstein said, and remember this is the 70s, so Rostow developed his model in the 60s when everything looked amazing in North America and people were very hopeful after the war and so on. In the 70s, people started to realize that there were challenges. We had huge famines in Africa at the time. There were extraordinary areas of poverty in the world. And so people were starting to realize that maybe the kind of possibilism, if you like, of the 60s wasn't going to benefit everybody. And so I think that Wallerstein was very much of his time in the 70s. And so his critique of the model was that, in fact, we can't look at the country scale. The nation-state scale wasn't the right one as far as he was concerned. And the world economy, he says, is one market with a global division of labor. What he meant by that was that some countries were specializing in some types of economic activities. Some countries were the producers of goods and services, and others were the consumers of those goods and services. So for geographers, this is really important because what he's talking about is the fact that it's a different scale. So what he said was, everything's taking place within the context of the world economy, and that there are power relations between places. And so not all countries will be able to get to stage 5 in the model. And he very much saw this uneven power relationship between the countries that have and the countries that have not, or between the wealthy countries and the poorer countries, as very much a requirement for the success of capitalism. So he was very much anti-capitalism in his model, and he saw capitalism as driven by profit for the in the global economy, and people very much in the wealthy countries exploiting the poorer countries to continue to grow their own economies. That was his point. So within the Wallerstein model, he talks about a three-tiered structure. He talks about the core of the world, where you have higher salaries, higher levels of income, higher levels of education generally, and technology use. And therefore you have higher levels of wealth. He talks about the periphery countries, where you have the opposite: lower salaries, lower levels of technology use, lower incomes, and lower wealth. And then he talks about places in the middle of that, which are the semi-periphery, where both those sets of processes are happening at the same time. So these are places that are exploited by the core countries, but they're also in turn exploiting the periphery at the same time. So here is the map that is in your textbook, and I've referenced it in the slides. But if you just study this for a moment, you can see the countries in orange here are the core, what are called the core countries. The green countries are the periphery countries. And then the semi-periphery countries are the ones in between. There's also this dashed line here, and that's used to refer to China, because at the time when he developed his model, he wasn't sure which category to put it in, and so he basically placed China outside of his model. And I think you could argue now that China is becoming part of the core, but that at the time when he developed his model, it was much more peripheral. So China's a complicated example, but if we look at the other three categories, and if you look at the two extremes, the core and the periphery, here would be my next question for you. What's the relationship that you can see here to colonialism? So what is the relationship, I'll take the question, between colonialism and the core periphery model? So which countries are now part of the core and why, and which countries are part of the periphery in his model and why? Yes, so I'm starting to see some really good answers. Ryan is just talking here about British and French influences on the core countries, and you're quite right. And also you can see the core countries, for example, of Spain and France, Italy, and so on. And yes, some really good answers coming in there. So you're absolutely right. Those of you who are typing right now, the countries, the key message of this diagram to me is that the countries that were the colonial powers are in fact still very much the part of the core countries now. So that's that's the message, and also of course becomes a critique of Rostow's model, which is that, I don't know how to say this nicely, but once you're on top, once you're in charge, once you're in power, you tend to stay there because you set things up to benefit you. So you can see that the European original colonial powers and their allies remain the core countries. And what's important about this is, do you remember we looked at that map of the world and I asked you were there any countries that had not been part of the colonial relationship? There was only one country that wasn't either a colonizer or colonized. I don't know if you remember. But basically the entire rest of the world was part of that colonial relationship, either colonizer or colonized. And because of that, Wallerstein's model applies everywhere across the world. Yes, Simon, very good point. Yes, good. So there are a couple of countries that have switched from being what we would call peripheral countries to being core countries. So can you think of a country or see a country that has switched from being periphery to, can't type and talk at the same time, to being core? Aiden's way ahead of me. Yes, Japan is a great example of that. What other countries? What other countries can you see on this map who were periphery to the European countries, but are now very much part of the core? Yes, well done, Jaden. You got it. It was Ethiopia. Well done. You got it. Yep. Everybody else has been involved in colonialism in some way. And the Italians tried in Ethiopia, but they failed. So what other countries? Aiden said Japan has moved from periphery to core. What else? China is definitely moving. Yes, South Korea. What about a bit closer to home? Think about who the British colonized. Yeah, well done, Victoria. So, yeah, Canada and the US and Australia were initially colonized particularly by Britain. And those colonies have now turned around and very much become part of the core. So generally, it's true to say that Canada, sorry, I'm typing and talking at the same time, which I shouldn't do. So it's generally true to say that if you were a colonizer, a European country that colonized, you became part of the core and stayed very much on top. But there are some exceptions in the periphery where people started in the periphery, such as Canada or the US or Japan, who then have now become part of the core. But it's a good model to think about power relations and economic relations in the world. So well done in thinking that through. Okay, so let's talk about a couple more concepts here. The dependency theory is a very helpful theory. And I just want to make a big note here in your notes. Dependency theory is not the same as dependency ratio. Dependency ratio is what we talked about with population pyramids, where we were talking about how many people the workforce supported who were dependent on them. The dependency theory is a relationship that's quite different. Here we're talking about the political and economic relationships between countries, and the way that the peripheral countries are generally dependent on the core countries for their economic well-being. So if a wealthy country decides to switch where it buys its products from, it will be just fine, but the periphery country that it's switched from buying from will suffer hugely. So the dependency theory suggests that that relationship is not reciprocal. Whilst the wealthy countries, the periphery countries depend on the wealthy countries for their capital and their investments and their buying power, the wealthy countries can easily switch their purchasing somewhere else. So it's not reciprocal. Neocolonialism is something that people had commented on or talked about in the chat, which was excellent that you realized this, means that even though colonialism officially, that is political ownership or control of a country, even though colonialism is largely gone now, officially countries are independent, because of the way that trading relationships were set up. We have something we call neocolonialism, which means that those power relations still remain. The world powers still tend to control the economies of the poorer countries, even though they are politically independent. So, for example, we've talked about sugar production, for example, in the Caribbean, and how all the wealth of that production went through the headquarters in London, and it still does. So if you want to sell and buy sugar, you tend to be trading through London to do that. So those power relations, those trade relations remain even after the Caribbean states become independent. So structuralist theory states that these large-scale historical structures and relationships between the global north and the global south economies are pretty well established, and they are very, very hard to change. And I must admit, it's a bit depressing as a theory, because it's hard to see how you can get out from under it. It's hard to see how you can change it. So I just want to acknowledge that. Aiden's just asking a question here. Is there a trend towards a more prosperous country after decolonization where the colonized? So that's a really, really good question. The answer is both yes and no, I would say. It depends very much on the situation of the country. So in a case like Canada or the US, I would say that your question is a good one. Yes, that and yes, you're right that the country has become more prosperous after decolonization because industry and higher level economic functions were allowed to occur. But in other countries, such as India, for example, and a lot of countries in Africa, for a very long time, those colonial relationships meant that those countries stayed in primary production, which had a lower economic value, and that kept their wages down. We can see countries emerging from that now. You're perfectly right. India is a good example, but it's taken a really long time. So I would say yes and no. Great question. So now I should ask you, do you see a problem with Wallerstein's model? Because, as you know, all models do have challenges with them. So what would you say about his model? And does that have problems associated with it? What do you think? Just turning over my slides here. So Victoria is saying China doesn't really fit, and she's quite right. In some, so that's definitely one critique. In some textbooks, they take out any of the countries that were formerly referred to as the communist countries, and they just don't include those in the model. But so that and yeah, so you're right, Victoria. That is one of my main critiques, that it is a sad model. And so it means that you can't. There's no, I think why I have trouble with it is that, and that's sort of what Victoria is saying here, is that you can't, there's no real way out of it. It's such a sad model because you can't get out of it. And it's a bit hopeless. And I think for many of us that means that it's hard to act. So that makes it hard. Other people are saying that it's a bit simplistic because you're dividing countries into three categories, and that's absolutely right. Yes, it's a bit too simple in that way. We also saw in the major recessions of the 80s and 90s that countries such as Brazil cycled in and out. There appeared to be what everyone thought was sort of progress towards wealth along the roster model, and then the country started going backwards because of the high interest rates, because of the money that they owed. So there are certainly problems with it, and someone else is saying it doesn't really account for what's happening in Asia now, and I think that's true. Both of these models were a lot more Western based, so you're making some really good observations. So if I asked you in a final exam which model you think best fits, you would really be able to critique both of the models really well now. So that's great. That's a good tip for the exam. So if we summarize, I tried to summarize this for you in a table, just to kind of try and bring it together. With my apologies to people who know a lot about this, it's very simple, but I'm just trying to give people a sense of the two extremes of models of economic development, because if you understand the extremes, you can maybe see how things might come together more in the middle. So Rostow's model really favors development. And in terms of its worldview, it's very much underpinned by a capitalist worldview. It has a neoliberal model underneath it, free market approaches to things. You allow labor rates to float down, so you have cheap labor. It's profit driven, and you're selling things on world markets. So what is possible in this model is basically this idea of the 60s that anything is possible. That, that the economy will drive the country out of poverty, that people will get wealthy, and we will all get better together. So that's the sort of capitalist model. It's a terribly basic way of describing it, but that is what underpins what Rostow was assuming and driving towards. Wallerstein's model is the opposite of that. It's more of a Marxist model or a socialist model, and it explains why the capitalist model doesn't work particularly well. That is, people are not able to leave the cycle of poverty because of their dependence on the capitalist countries that are exploiting them. So he talks about historical power relations and how very, very hard it is to get rid of those, and how very, very hard it is to equalize power or wealth within the world. And so in his model, it's a little bit what Victoria was saying, nothing is possible, in the sense that it's very, very hard to change anything. That was the point that he was making. So it is a rather depressing model in that way. I do feel, as usual, that both models have some elements of truth in them, but there's problems with both of them, and so I wanted to share those two extremes with you so that you could get a sense of the kinds of conversations that you would see, that you would read in journal articles. So now let's talk a little bit about measures of development. And again, I apologize to the economists who are here, who are listening, because you know a lot of other ways of measuring economics and economic measures that I won't talk about here, but I'm just giving everybody a few of these so you have a sense of them. So when we're measuring the wealth of a country, we often will use a term called a measure called gross national income. We also talk about gross domestic product and so on. Again, I just want to share just a few terms with people so they have some frame of reference here. So gross national income is, roughly speaking, the income of a country. And we usually, so that we can compare countries, we usually report it in US dollars. Now remember, it only includes the formal economy. Remember, we talked about formal trading and paying taxes and all those kinds of things. It doesn't include the illegal economy or the barter economy or any kinds of informal trading activities that the government's unaware of. So you can see already that is a bit problematic. The more a country depends on its informal economy, the less the GNI will be that will be recorded. But nevertheless, we need something to go on. So Victoria's asking, is GNI the same as GDP? No, it's not quite the same, Victoria, and I'm happy to have an offline conversation with you about that. Gross national income also includes offshore income and financial trading and so on, whereas gross domestic product is the products and services that you produce. So GNI includes other things, other financial things usually that aren't part of the GDP, so tends to be a bit bigger. But you could certainly use GDP as well. So I just thought we'd talk about this one, but GDP is totally fine as well. So you've already mentioned, some of you, that economic measures of wealth are not the only way of thinking about well-being in a country, and you're 100% right. So we use other indicators as well to see how a country is doing. Technology is one of those. So, for example, I've shown you previously the connections in telecommunications. If countries have well-developed rail networks, cell networks, airline phone networks, they're generally thought to be at a higher level of development, and also to have stronger economies as a result. Perhaps the most important other measures to think about are social measures, such as the ones we've been talking about, like infant mortality rates or disease rates, and so on. So we've talked a lot in population pyramids about child mortality and infant mortality and access to healthcare and so on. And we've talked about the fact that there isn't a direct relationship between how much money we spend on healthcare and life expectancy. So social welfare measures of development look at the wellness, the broader wellness of people in society. And I think they're really important measures. And here's just a reminder that dependency ratio is not the same as dependency theory. And I didn't want you to get tripped up by that. So dependency ratio, the number of dependents that each 100 employed people can support. And so you want that ratio to mean that you have as many people working as possible to support those folks, as opposed to dependency theory, which is the dependency between countries around their economy. Okay, so if we put together economic measures, technology measures, and social welfare measures of development, we often end up using something called a composite measure. And that's what the Human Development Index is, which is produced by the United Nations. The Human Development Index puts together a bunch of different measures of development in order to determine how a country is doing. They don't just use economics to measure it. And so here's a slide that I've provided for you, and I'll put it up just because you can read it. But it takes three basic dimensions: life expectancy, education or knowledge, and standard of living, and puts them together in a composite measure to see how countries are doing. And in 2000, for the millennium, the UN adopted a declaration that had a goal of improving conditions for people in countries around the world with the lowest human development standards. And it set 8 specific Millennium Development Goals that it hoped, the UN hoped, could be achieved by 2015. Now, it might surprise you to know, or not surprise you to know, that sadly those goals were not met. But certainly even talking about them created some change. The UN therefore decided to expand its original goals for 2000 that it hoped would be achieved by 2015 to a further 17 sustainable development goals. So I'm not sure what the wisdom was of moving on to a new set of goals before they had really focused on the others, but there we are. So if you look up those websites that I've given you, you will see what the original goals were, and those are on the left of the slide. And then you can also go to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and read those and see what you think about those. But even if you look at the original 8, you can see the kinds of things we've been talking about in terms of life expectancy and child mortality and so on. And you can see that there's a very much of a human welfare element to them. So I think this is a good measure to use, and probably one of the most accurate that we could find. You can certainly think about which goals you think would be the most important and why, like which of these actual individual goals you think would be most important. So I would encourage you for the final to look at these UN goals and see which ones you feel are most important. So I would encourage you to do that. So you can see that there are lots of examples around the world of governments trying to attempt to influence development. And this isn't just economic development, although some of it is, but also development towards the UN goals in general and human well-being in general. And some of these are controversial, some of them you may agree with, and others you may find not as helpful as perhaps they were intended to be. If any of you have taken Cindy Ann Rose Redwood's course on the Caribbean, you'll know that tourism is a somewhat controversial way of improving a country's well-being through investment. She talks about that a lot in her courses. She's very knowledgeable about that. But tourism is certainly one way that governments have tried to increase wealth in their country and bring investment. You can see others here on the slide. World Bank loans to try to get economies started. Literacy campaigns, because we know that there is a strong relationship between the education level of the mother in particular, of the child, and how well the child does in life, how nutrition and healthcare and so on. Economic development zones have been a very controversial topic. They usually involve considerable tax breaks, sometimes no tax at all, for foreign countries investing in particular areas of a country. The idea, of course, is to get the economy going and then hope that it will continue. The critique of it, of course, is that if the country then removes the tax breaks, the chances are that the company will just go somewhere else to a different country with different tax breaks. So, some pros and cons there. Some countries, of course, have tried to, because of the critiques of colonialism, the critiques of the capitalist world economy, and not wanting to be part of Wallerstein's power relationships that he's documented, some countries have literally tried to take themselves out of the world economy to essentially be self-sufficient. And that was the strategy somewhat that Cuba tried to use for many years, for example. So some countries trying to sort of recognizing that being part of this power relation in the world economy wasn't really helping them, thinking that maybe taking themselves out of that power relationship altogether might be the best way forward. So we do have some examples of that. And then we've talked about migration and trying to employ high caliber labor and so on. So just be aware of some of the examples that have been used, that governments have used around the world to try to influence development in various ways. And again, this is taking a broad version of development. There's a special role here that non-governmental organizations play. Often they are charities. Often they have religious backing to them in some way or another. And each non-governmental organization or each charity is in some way trying to reduce suffering, but it will have its own goals depending on the primary concerns of the fundraisers themselves, the board members, and so on. I've given you some examples on the slide here of ones that are likely to be familiar to you. Charities such as World Vision or CARE or the Red Cross and so on. What I would say about this is that it's really important that whenever you're going to donate money to anybody, it's worth checking on who's on the board of the association, checking their processes, checking to see what percentage of the money that you give actually goes to the people it's intended for, as opposed to administration of the charity. And just finding out what its principles, its beliefs, and its values are. We all have different charities that we support and care about, and so on. And all I would suggest or recommend is that you just look carefully into charities that you give money to, and just make sure that their values are your own values. And I think that will give you a more of a sense of reassurance. Yeah. So just think about that. Microcredit programs have been suggested as a really good way of helping countries to improve their standard of living or to improve the welfare of their citizens. Often microcredit is given to women in countries where women are doing the majority of the farming, for example. And this has encouraged the development of small businesses and may indeed help the children of the women in the small businesses, gives them self-sufficiency is the idea. There have been critiques of microcredit programs if the debt level is too high, that people get into trouble, or if we don't understand the social structures of people in the society. So, for example, early on, charities were often giving money to the males in society, whereas in fact it was the women who were doing the farming, for example. And so there was a lot of learning that went on early on to try to improve the efficacy of these programs. And again, what I would say is that some of them work really well. and others, so it's best just to look into the ones that you're thinking of supporting. I've given you an example here on the slide of CARE's small loan program for women in Kisumu, which is the poorest city in Kenya. It's third in size, but it's the poorest. And that's one example of a program that's been talked about a lot. Here's an example of just one organization. I'm not advocating for this organization, I'm just showing it as one example. When you look on their website, you can see where they work in the world and the kinds of things they do. But again, you would dig behind it to see, just to see what's going on in the organization and whether your values and their values align. So again, not an advocacy here, just an example. Kibera is one of the slums or squatter settlements that we had talked about in Kenya. It's one just outside Nairobi. They don't truly know how many people are there. Estimates are about 700,000 people. According to the government, it doesn't exist. And therefore, those are 700,000 people or more who are not accommodated, accounted for, or given services. But Bill Bryson, who I talked to you about, who wrote the book about with the picture on the front cover of the city where I come from in England, wrote this book. He's quite a famous author, and so all the proceeds, for example, of the book that he wrote about Kibera go to support that charity work. So that's the kind of thing that certain authors are doing. So I wanted to kind of finish up by just giving you some really good questions to think about. You guys are really good at asking good questions and critical thinking questions now. But here are some questions I would ask. And these are the kinds of questions I might think about asking on the exam. So when you think about the example of Jamaica, Jamaica was colonized by the British. Jamaica was a country that had incredibly abundant and diversity of soils, and therefore had a wonderful, vibrant agricultural economy, growing fruits and vegetables, and was entirely self-sustaining. The British arrived. They took over they colonized, so they took over Jamaica and took ownership of the island. They leveled the farms and created sugar plantations on them. They brought in slaves from Africa to work the farms, and they created huge sugar plantations. And the sugar was then exported globally, and the profits from that were sent back to London. And we've talked a little bit about this. But what do you think happened then to the well-being of local Jamaicans? I want to see if you have time to answer this question. So what do you think happened once the country went over to full-scale sugar plantation production? What do you think happened to the people who had owned land in Jamaica and who had planted their crops in Jamaica? Yeah, so Aiden has started typing. Yeah, Tina is talking. So Tiana is talking. So yes, basically it created poverty, but also extreme hunger. Because, I mean, they also did the same thing with bananas, by the way. So there's only so much bananas and sugar that you can actually eat. And you certainly can't eat it every single day as a balanced diet. So people started to get, they became hungry. You're quite right, they lost their culture associated with the production that they'd had. They lost a lot of their cultural knowledge around how to grow food and different diversity types of food, how to keep pests down and so on. And they became hungry. And so, believe it or not, Jamaica, which is this beautiful, beautiful country of lush forests and diverse food production, actually started to import food. So I always think of Jamaica as my kind of key example to understand the lecture today. I think of, these models of Rostow and Wallerstein. I think about colonialism and the colonizer-colonized relationship. I think about migration in terms of slavery. You can put all of this together into the example of what's happened in the Caribbean, particularly in places like Jamaica. So it's not so much perhaps about the resources that you have in your country, but whether or not you have control over them. Those are the key things. So I'm going to close there. I'm really excited because I got to the end of my slides, and I will put up my kind of slides after class thing. But I just wanted to thank all of you for coming and hanging out and having lecture with me today. And I hope it's helped you a little bit with your learning. And I will lecture again on the second part of economic geography on next week, or next class, and next on Monday. And yes, Aidan, I will think over the weekend, and I will send everyone on Course Spaces an idea about the final exam. Okay? I will make sure to send a note on Course Spaces about what that final exam will look like and how we will do it so that none of you need to worry. Okay? I want you to keep studying, keep coming to class online, even though it's not perfect. And you're doing an amazing job, all of you. I promise everything will be fine. And I will send out a note, okay? I will send out a note to Course Spaces telling everyone what the final exam will look like and how we will do it. Okay. And if you have any other questions in the meantime, okay, don't hesitate to email me. I'm here all the time, just studying my classes and everything and trying to keep everybody supported, okay? So I'm thinking of you all. I care about you. And if you get into trouble personally or anything that's going on, just email me, okay? So, thank you for coming. And I will see you on Monday, I hope. And I will give you a Course Spaces message in the meantime. Okay? Take care. Lots of love to you all. Bye.